A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. We are coming to you from our home here in Jerusalem on a beautiful Wednesday evening, March 18th, 2026. I am Corn Pubbleberry, and sitting across from me is my brother, looking particularly caffeinated today.
Herman Poppleberry, at your service. And yes, I have had about 3 espressos because today's topic is one of those massive, sprawling historical narratives that I have been obsessed with for years. Our housemate Daniel sent us a voice note earlier asking about something that really hits close to home for us living here in the Middle East, but it is a story that is often left out of the history books in the West.
It really is. Daniel was asking about the history of Jews in the Arab-speaking world. It is a fascinating prompt because when most people in the United States or Europe think about Jewish history, they immediately go to the shtetls of Poland, the Yiddish language, and the tragic events of the Holocaust in Europe. That is a vital part of the story, of course, but it is not the whole story. There is this entire other half of the Jewish experience that took place in Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, and Casablanca.
We are talking about communities that were established in the Middle East and North Africa centuries, and in some cases millennia, before the first Jewish person ever stepped foot in Germany or Russia. And yet, if you look at the map today, those populations have almost entirely vanished. It is a demographic collapse that happened in the span of a single generation. In 1948, there were nearly 1 million Jews living across the Arab world. Today, that number is likely fewer than 5,000, with the vast majority of those living in Morocco and Tunisia.
It is staggering when you look at the numbers. We are going to dive into how these communities functioned, what it was like to live as a minority under Islamic rule, and what happened in the middle of the 20th century that led to nearly 1 million people leaving their ancestral homes. But before we get into the heavy history, let's define what we mean by Arab-Jewish identity.
That is a great place to start, Corn, because if you go back to the early 20th century, you had roughly 850,000 to 1 million Jews living across the Arab world. They were linguistically and culturally integrated. They spoke Arabic as their mother tongue, they ate the same food as their neighbors, and they listened to the same music. And yet, in Western discourse, this history is often relegated to a footnote. We have this Ashkenazi-centric bias where the European experience is treated as the universal Jewish experience.
Right. And we touched on this back in episode 1301, when we talked about the secret history of Jewish languages. We discussed how Judeo-Arabic was the vehicle for some of the greatest intellectual achievements in Jewish history. It was not just a dialect, it was a bridge between cultures. People often forget that for a huge portion of history, Arabic was the primary language of Jewish scholarship and daily life.
Even Maimonides, who is arguably the greatest Jewish philosopher of the Middle Ages, wrote his most famous work, The Guide for the Perplexed, in Judeo-Arabic, not Hebrew. He used the Arabic language to explain Jewish theology through the lens of Aristotelian philosophy. It shows just how deeply rooted these communities were in the cultural fabric of the Arab world. They weren't just living next to the Arab culture, they were an integral part of it.
So let's break down the demographics. When we talk about these communities, we aren't talking about a monolith. You had the Babylonian Jews in Iraq, whose roots go back 2,700 years to the first exile after the destruction of the first temple in 586 BCE. That is a level of continuity that is almost hard to wrap your head around. They were there before the Arab conquest, before Islam, and they stayed through the rise and fall of countless empires.
Then you had the merchant classes in Aleppo and Damascus in Syria. You had the Maghrebi Jews in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. You had the ancient community in Yemen, which lived in relative isolation for centuries. These were diverse, thriving, and deeply established populations. In Baghdad alone, at the turn of the 20th century, 1 out of every 4 people was Jewish. Think about that. Baghdad was one of the most Jewish cities in the world by percentage.
How did they maintain that identity for over 2,000 years while being surrounded by changing empires? It seems like they had to navigate a very complex social landscape.
It comes down to the legal framework they lived under, which was the dhimmi system. We did a deep dive on this in episode 1319, looking at the Pact of Umar. But for those who haven't heard that one, the word dhimmi basically means protected person. Under Islamic law, Jews and Christians were considered people of the book. They were allowed to practice their religion, they were protected from physical harm, and they had a degree of internal autonomy.
But that protection came at a price, right? It wasn't exactly a system of equal rights.
Not at all. It was a very specific kind of social hierarchy. They had to pay a special poll tax called the jizya, which was a physical manifestation of their subordinate status. The Pact of Umar also mandated specific social markers. Dhimmis were often forbidden from building new houses of worship or repairing old ones. They couldn't ride horses, only donkeys, and they had to ride side saddle. They even had to wear specific colors or patches on their clothing to distinguish themselves from Muslims. In many ways, the yellow badge that we associate with the Middle Ages in Europe actually had its origins in these early Islamic dress codes.
It sounds like a system designed to keep a community in a state of permanent, visible subordination. You are allowed to exist, but you can never be equal. How does that compare to the experience of Jews in medieval Europe?
That is the crucial distinction. In Christian Europe, Jews were often viewed as outsiders or even enemies of the state. You had cycles of total expulsion, like in England in 1290 or Spain in 1492. You had massacres during the Crusades and the Black Death. In the Islamic world, the dhimmi status was much more stable. It was a contract. As long as you paid your tax and accepted your social limitations, you were safe.
So, it was a floor, but it was also a ceiling.
And this is where the debate over the Golden Age comes in. Some historians point to periods like 10th century Spain under the Umayyads or 8th century Baghdad under the Abbasids as times of incredible coexistence, and they are right. Jews were thriving economically. During the Abbasid Caliphate, Jewish traders known as the Radhanites were the essential intermediaries in trade networks that stretched from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to China. They spoke multiple languages and moved silk, spices, and manuscripts across borders that were often closed to others.
They were the globalists of the Middle Ages.
They really were. But other historians point out that this was always precarious. If a new, more fundamentalist ruler came to power, those protections could vanish. For example, in the 12th century, the Almohad dynasty in North Africa and Spain gave Jews a choice: convert to Islam or be executed. That is why Maimonides' family had to flee Spain and eventually settle in Egypt. So, the reality is somewhere between the Golden Age myth and the persecution myth. It was a system of tolerated inequality.
So you have this system that lasts for over a millennium. You have Jews who are culturally Arab, speaking the language, eating the food, but religiously distinct. What starts to change as we move into the modern era?
The 19th century is the turning point. As the Ottoman Empire begins to weaken, European colonial powers like France and Britain move in. The Europeans brought with them ideas of citizenship and equality, but they also used the local Jewish and Christian minorities as a bridgehead for their influence. In Algeria, for instance, the French granted the entire Jewish population French citizenship in 1870 through the Crémieux Decree.
I can see how that would create massive tension. If the local Muslim population sees the Jewish community gaining favor or legal status through European intervention, it turns the Jews from a tolerated minority into a potential fifth column in the eyes of their neighbors.
That is exactly what happened. It broke the old dhimmi contract. Suddenly, the Jews were no longer subordinate, they were often legally superior to the local Muslims because of their ties to the colonial powers. This created a reservoir of resentment that would boil over in the 20th century with the rise of Arab nationalism and Zionism.
And that brings us to the 20th century, which is where the collapse happens. We have the rise of the State of Israel, but even before 1948, there were warning signs. You mentioned the Farhud in Iraq. Can we talk about that?
The Farhud is a critical, tragic moment that is rarely taught in Western schools. It happened in June of 1941 in Baghdad. At the time, Iraq was under the influence of a pro-Nazi government that had seized power in a coup. Nazi propaganda had been pumped into Iraq for years by the German ambassador Fritz Grabe. When the coup collapsed and the British were approaching the city, a massive pogrom broke out.
1941. So this is happening simultaneously with the Holocaust in Europe.
Yes. For 2 days, mobs attacked the Jewish quarters of Baghdad. About 180 Jews were killed, hundreds more were injured, and thousands of homes and businesses were looted. For the Iraqi Jews, who had been there for 2,700 years, it was a psychological earthquake. It was the moment they realized that the old rules of protection were gone. Even though the community tried to rebuild after the British regained control, the trust was fundamentally broken.
And then we get to 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel. How did that impact the communities in places like Egypt and Syria?
It was the end of the road. In the eyes of the newly independent Arab states, their Jewish citizens were now seen as representatives of the enemy. In Egypt, the government began a systematic campaign of state-sponsored persecution. After the 1948 war, and especially after the Suez Crisis in 1956, the Egyptian government under Gamal Abdel Nasser began mass expulsions.
I have read about the Suez Crisis expulsions. It wasn't just a suggestion to leave, it was a forced exodus.
It was brutal. Thousands of Jews were given only a few days to leave. They were stripped of their Egyptian citizenship and their assets were nationalized. They were allowed to take only one suitcase and a small amount of money. Their travel documents were stamped with the words laissez-passer, valable pour un seul voyage, sans retour. One-way trip, no return. They were effectively turned into refugees overnight.
It is the same pattern we see across the region. In 1948, there were about 135,000 Jews in Iraq. By 1952, almost all of them were gone. How did that happen so fast?
It was a combination of fear and state pressure. The Iraqi government made Zionism a capital offense. They froze Jewish bank accounts. In 1950 and 1951, the Iraqi parliament passed a law allowing Jews to leave if they renounced their citizenship and left all their property behind. It was a trap, but for many, it was the only way out. Israel launched Operation Ezra and Nehemiah, which was a massive airlift. Over 120,000 Iraqi Jews were flown to Israel in a matter of months.
This is a point you made earlier that I want to circle back to. We often hear about the Palestinian refugees from the 1948 war, which is a major historical event. But we rarely hear about the nearly equal number of Jewish refugees from Arab lands.
That is a very important point, Korn. There was essentially a population exchange in the Middle East during the mid-20th century. About 700,000 Palestinians became refugees, and about 850,000 Jews from Arab and Muslim countries became refugees. The difference is in the aftermath. The Arab world, for the most part, kept the Palestinian refugees in camps to use as a political tool against Israel. Israel, despite being a tiny, impoverished new country, absorbed the Jewish refugees and made them citizens.
But that absorption wasn't easy. I want to talk about that transition because it wasn't just a happy homecoming. These people were coming from high-culture cities like Baghdad and Cairo and being dropped into tent cities in the Israeli desert.
Right, the Ma'abaro, or transit camps. This is a very painful chapter in Israeli history. You had the established Israeli leadership, who were mostly Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe. They were secular, socialist, and very Western-oriented. They looked at these massive waves of Jews arriving from Iraq, Morocco, Yemen, and Egypt, and they didn't see brothers, they saw a cultural threat.
I can imagine the culture clash. The Ashkenazi establishment looked at these new arrivals and, in many cases, saw them as primitive because they came from the Middle East.
There was a real sense of cultural superiority. There are documented stories of new arrivals being sprayed with DDT as they got off the planes, which was incredibly humiliating. Their traditional names were often changed to more Hebrew-sounding ones by government clerks. They were sent to live in remote development towns with poor infrastructure and few jobs. The term for these Jews is Mizrahim, which means Easterners. For decades, there was a massive socio-economic gap between the Ashkenazim and the Mizrahim.
It is interesting because it created a new kind of identity. In Iraq, they were Jews. In Israel, they became Mizrahim. They were grouped together regardless of whether they were from the urban elite of Egypt or the mountain villages of Morocco.
and that identity became a political force. This connects to what we talked about in episode 1260 regarding Arab identity in Israel. By the late 1970s, the Mizrahi community was tired of being treated like second-class citizens by the Labour Party establishment. In 1977, they turned out in massive numbers to vote for Menachem Begin and the Likud party. That was the Mahapach, the Great Upheaval. It was the first time the right wing won an election in Israel, and it was largely powered by the Mizrahi vote.
Which explains so much about the political landscape of Israel today. The Mizrahi community remains a core constituency for the conservative nationalist side of Israeli politics. They have a very different perspective on the region because they lived there for centuries.
That is a profound insight. If your family was kicked out of Baghdad or Cairo in the 1950s, you have a very clear-eyed, often skeptical view of the neighborhood. You don't have the same illusions about regional peace that some of the European-born founders might have had. That experience of displacement and the loss of their ancestral homes is baked into their political DNA. It is a defensive posture born of lived experience.
I want to go back to the cultural loss for a second. When those communities left, a massive part of the Arab world's own history went with them. It feels like a cultural amputation.
You nailed it. Think about the music. Some of the most famous singers in the Arab world in the early 20th century were Jewish. Salima Pasha in Iraq was so beloved that she was known as the voice of Iraq. Layla Morad in Egypt was a superstar of the silver screen. In Iraq, the national orchestra was almost entirely Jewish at one point. When they left, the cultural life of those countries was diminished.
And on the flip side, they brought that culture to Israel. Today, Mizrahi music is the most popular genre in the country.
It is the sound of modern Israel. You have artists like Dudu Tassa, who is the grandson of the Al-Kuwaiti brothers, two of the most famous musicians in Iraq. He is reclaiming their music, blending it with rock and electronic sounds. Or the band Awa, three sisters of Yemenite descent, who sing in Yemenite Arabic. It is this beautiful, complex reclamation of a history that was almost erased.
It is a reminder that the history of the Middle East isn't just a story of two opposing sides, but a story of deeply interconnected peoples who were torn apart by modern nationalism. So, looking at the practical takeaways from all this, why does this specific history matter so much for someone trying to understand the world today?
I think there are three big reasons. First, it completely refutes the idea that Jews are colonial interlopers in the Middle East. You can't be a colonist in a region where you have lived continuously for 2,700 years. The Mizrahi story proves that Jews are an indigenous people of the Middle East. They didn't arrive from Europe, they moved from one part of the region to another.
That is a powerful point. It shifts the entire framework of the conflict.
Second, it highlights the issue of justice and compensation. There was a lot of talk about the right of return and compensation for Palestinian refugees, and that is a legitimate discussion. But there has to be a parallel discussion about the billions of dollars in property and assets stolen from Jews in Arab lands. You can't have a regional peace without addressing both sides of that refugee coin. In 2014, the Israeli government even established an official day to mark the departure and expulsion of Jews from Arab countries and Iran, which is November 30th.
And the third reason?
The third is about the future. Israel's integration into the region depends on its ability to embrace its Middle Eastern identity. The Mizrahi community is the bridge. They understand the language, the culture, and the mindset of the region in a way that someone from Brooklyn or Moscow just doesn't. They are the key to a long-term sustainable presence for Israel in the Middle East.
It is fascinating to think of them as the bridge, but it also requires the Arab world to acknowledge its own history. Right now, as you said, these are ghost communities. Is there any sign that countries like Iraq or Egypt are willing to face that past?
It is starting, very slowly. In Morocco, King Mohammed VI has been very proactive about acknowledging Jewish history as an inseparable part of Moroccan identity. They have renovated hundreds of Jewish cemeteries and synagogues. In Egypt, they recently renovated the Eliyahu Hanavi Synagogue in Alexandria and the Ben Ezra Synagogue in Cairo. But in places like Iraq or Syria, the situation is much more tragic because of the ongoing instability. Most of the physical traces of those communities are being lost to war and neglect.
It is a race against time, then, to preserve the memory and the culture, even if the people are gone.
It really is. And that is why prompts like this one from Daniel are so important. We have to keep talking about these stories so they don't just fade into the background. The Jewish experience in the Arab world is one of the most vibrant, complex, and ultimately heartbreaking chapters of human history.
I think it also serves as a warning about the fragility of minority rights. You can have a system that works for 1,000 years, like the dhimmi system, but if it is built on a foundation of inequality, rather than true citizenship, it can collapse the moment the political winds change.
That is a very sober and accurate assessment. True stability comes from equality, not from being a protected subordinate. The Jews of the Arab world learned that lesson the hard way in the 20th century.
Well, this has been a deep one. I feel like we have just scratched the surface, even after all this time. There are so many specific stories, like the Jews of Yemen who were airlifted in Operation Magic Carpet, or the unique culture of the Jews of Java in Tunisia.
We could do 10 episodes on this and still have more to say. But I hope this gives people a framework to start thinking about Jewish history in a more global, less Eurocentric way.
Definitely. And for our listeners, if you want to dive deeper into some of the themes we mentioned, I highly recommend checking out episode 1319 on the dhimmi system and episode 1301 on Jewish languages. They really provide the necessary background for what we talked about today.
And if you are interested in how this historical migration has shaped the modern identity of the Middle East, episode 1260 on Arab identity in Israel is a great follow-up.
Before we wrap up, I just want to say, if you are enjoying these deep dives, please take a second to leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It really helps other people find the show, and allows us to keep exploring these weird and wonderful prompts.
Yeah, it genuinely makes a difference. We love seeing where you all are listening from and what topics you want us to tackle next.
You can find all our past episodes, our RSS feed, and a contact form at myweirdprompts.com. And if you are on Telegram, just search for My Weird Prompts to join our channel and get notified every time a new episode drops.
It has been a pleasure, Korn. I think I need another espresso after that one.
I think I need a nap. That is the difference between a donkey and a sloth, I guess.
Fair enough. Until next time, everyone.
Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. We will be back soon with another prompt from Daniel, or from one of you. Take care.
So, when we talk about the specific demographics, I think it is worth mentioning that in 1900, Baghdad was arguably the most Jewish city in the world by percentage. It is a fact that blows people's minds. 1 out of every 4 people you met on the street was Jewish. They weren't just a minority, they were the urban fabric.
And that is what makes the disappearance so haunting. Imagine if a quarter of New York City or London just vanished over the course of 3 years. The city would be unrecognizable.
And that is the reality of the post-1948 Arab world. It is a world that lost a massive part of its own soul. And on the other side, Israel is a country that was fundamentally transformed by their arrival. It is a story of loss on one side and a very complicated, difficult rebirth on the other.
It is a story that is still being written every day here in Jerusalem. You see it in the markets, you hear it in the prayers, and you feel it in the politics.
It is the living history of this place.
Well said. All right, let's head out.
Sounds good.
This has been My Weird Prompts. See you next time.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the flows from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep